The memory of my father's study was a ghost, a faint whisper of ink and parchment that lingered in my mind as a cruel joke. That world, a world of books and learning, was ash. His death had not been a conclusion but a catalyst transforming obscure debts into iron manacles, a beloved daughter into property. The air in the holding pen was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and despair, a bitter perfume for the newly branded. We were a collection of broken things, our futures seared away in an instant by the slaver's iron. I did not feel the heat at first, only a pressure, and then an agony so absolute it was a silent scream behind my eyes. The smell of my own burning flesh would be the scent I associated with my own end. The brand was a perfect, cruel circle, a weeping wound that marked the death of Elara. I was no one. I was a thing, destined for the choking dust of the mines, or a brief, bloody end in the pits. I huddled in the scratchy straw, the throbbing in my cheek a constant drumbeat of shame, and waited for the cart that would take me to my short and miserable future. The groan of the heavy oak door was a sound of doom. Corbin, the slaver, filled the doorway, his small eyes scanning his inventory with dispassionate greed. But he was not alone. Two men flanked him, their postures rigid, their uniforms a stark, imposing black and silver. The royal guard. A paralyzing fear swept through the pen. This was an unprecedented, terrifying visitation. Corbin's piggish eyes scanned the cowering forms and then, with a dreadful certainty, landed on me. His thick finger pointed. That one. My heart stopped. This was it, the pits. I braced for the shackles, for a blow. The guards approached. I flinched, but the expected violence did not come. One of them spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion, yet not unkind. On your feet, trembling, my legs barely supporting me, I obeyed. The other guard did not produce chains. Instead, he held a length of soft, gray cloth. With an efficiency that felt almost ritualistic, he gently, carefully, covered the weeping brand on my cheek, tying the bandage securely at the back of my head. The simple act of care was more disorienting than any brutality. Come, the first guard said. They led me, not to a wagon, but through the bustling heart of the capital. The splendor of the Sunstone Palace rose in the distance, its towers piercing the clouds, its walls glowing as if infused with light itself. It was a myth, a story told to poor children, and I was being marched toward it. We entered through a side gate, and the world shifted into a realm of impossible quiet and grandeur. Courtiers in silk stared, their eyes wide with curiosity and a sharp, cold disdain for the ragged, bandaged girl escorted by the king's own. The confusion was a torment worse than any certainty. I was brought to a chamber that was not a throne room but a sanctuary of knowledge. The air was rich with the scent of old paper, lemon oil, and dried lavender. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust. And there, standing before a vast table strewn with maps and arcane instruments, was King Theron himself. He was younger than his coins depicted, his face etched with the lines of thought and a deep, abiding sorrow. His hair was the color of dark wheat, and his eyes, a startling cobalt blue, held me with an intensity that made me want to disappear into the polished floor. The guards bowed and retreated, sealing me in the silence with the most powerful man in the realm. For a long moment, he simply looked at me, his gaze a physical weight taking in my tattered dress, my grimy hands, the bandage that concealed my shame. His silence was a greater interrogation than any shouting. Remove it, he said, his voice quiet, yet it filled the room, absolute and undeniable. Tears of hot humiliation welled in my eyes. Was this his pleasure? To see the mark of his lowest subject up close? To witness the evidence of his kingdom's justice? With fingers that shook uncontrollably, I fumbled with the knot at the back of my head. The cloth fell away. The cool air stung the raw, exposed brand. I could not bear to look at him, so I fixed my gaze on the intricate patterns of the rug beneath my worn shoes. I heard his footsteps, soft on the woven threads. Then a finger, surprisingly gentle, touched my chin and lifted my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for his disgust. Look at me, child, he commanded, his voice softer now, layered with an emotion I could not name. I forced my eyes open. He was not looking at me with revulsion or cruelty, but with a profound, weary sadness that seemed to emanate from the very core of him. His gaze was fixed on the brand. Do you know what this is? He asked, his thumb hovering just beside the wound, not touching it. I shook my head, a sob catching in my raw throat. A debtor's mark, Your Majesty.no, he said, the word firm, final. It is that, by law, a brutal, simplified truth, but it is also something far older. A sigil, a key. He turned and picked up a heavy, ancient tome from the table, opening it to a page marked with a silken ribbon. Upon the yellowed parchment was drawn an exact duplicate of the brand on my cheek, a circle intersected by a single, straight line. For a year, my seers and archivists have scoured this kingdom, searching for this sign. It was foretold that the one who bears this mark, willingly or not, would be the key to breaking a curse that has plagued my bloodline for generations. A wasting illness that takes my heirs on their 18th birthday. My son, his voice faltered, the regal mask cracking to reveal the raw, terrified father beneath, turned 17 in 3 moons' time. I stared, my mind reeling, the world tilting on its axis. The slaver's random, cruel iron, a prophesied sigil, my profound shame a key. The magic of old does not care for the laws of men, the king continued, his eyes holding mine, willing me to understand. It does not see queens or slaves, it only sees the vessel. The prophecy stated the bearer would be an innocent, marked by circumstance. Your debt, your branding. It was a horrific injustice, but it also, impossibly, made you the one I have been searching for. He sank into a chair, the weight of a kingdom and a father's fear bowing his shoulders. I cannot erase the brand. The magic is tied to the scar, to the story it tells. But I can offer you this. Help me. Lend me your mark. Submit to the rituals. Stand as the focal point for the magic that might save my son. In return, I will not only pardon your debt, I will grant you your freedom, lands, title, anything within my power to give. I stood there, the throbbing in my cheek suddenly feeling different. It was no longer just the pain of seared flesh, but a pulse of something else, of significance, of a terrible, frightening purpose. The thing meant to make me nothing had made me everything. I had been chosen, not by a slaver's greed, but by a king's desperation, not for my strength or my wisdom, but for my wound. I looked at the king, not as a slave to a master, but as one soul beholding another in a moment of shared, strange destiny. The words that left my lips were a whisper, but they were my own, my first act of will in a long time. I was branded to be broken, I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. But if this mark can be used to mend, then I am yours to command, your majesty. King Theron nodded, a flicker of fragile hope igniting in his desperate blue eyes. And in that moment, the girl who had been Elara, the girl who had been a slave, began the unimaginable transformation into the woman who would save a prince. The silence in my new chambers was a different kind of noise. It was not the oppressive quiet of the holding pen, thick with shared despair, but a vast echoing stillness that seemed to swallow sound whole. Sunlight, clear and unforgiving, streamed through a tall window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like forgotten spirits. The room itself was a masterpiece of understated luxury, all pale silks and dark, polished wood. A bed wider than my entire pallet at home dominated the space, its linen smelling of lavender and a crispness I associated with wealth. It was a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating. A soft knock preceded the entrance of a woman whose demeanor was as severe and precise as her tightly bound silver hair. She introduced herself as Linnea, the royal archivist. Her eyes, the color of flint, did not shy away from the bandage on my cheek, but they held no judgment, only a deep, weary knowledge. She carried with her the scent of old paper and dried herbs, a smell that would soon become the backdrop of my new existence. Your education begins now, she stated, her voice leaving no room for dissent. The king's hope is a powerful currency, but it is not a strategy. To be the key, you must understand the lock. Thus began my tutelage. Our classroom was a secluded alcove in the palace's immense library, a world of towering shelves and the soft, rustling whisper of 1,000 pages. Linnea was a relentless, but fair taskmaster. She laid before me not storybooks, but histories, dry, dense chronicles of the Theron bloodline, genealogies that stretched back centuries, and fragmented, poetic texts that spoke of the curse. It was from these ancient, crumbling pages that I learned the specific, chilling nature of the affliction. It was not a random sickness. It was a systematic withering, a draining of life that began its slow, inexorable work on every crown prince in the year preceding his 18th birthday. It started with a lingering fatigue, a pallor that no sunshine could alleviate. Then came The weakness, the slow fading of the body as if the very soul was being leached away. Death always came on the eve of their majority, a final, cruel joke from a malice that had endured for generations. Prince Kaelen, I learned, had already entered. That fatal year, he was a specter in the Sunstone Palace. His name was spoken in hushed, tragic tones by the servants. His presence was felt in the way certain corridors were kept to quiet, in the specific dishes prepared by the kitchens that were said to be all he could keep down. My curiosity about him became a constant, low hum in my blood. Was he arrogant, resigned, afraid? I caught my first glimpse of him in the palace gardens. I had taken to walking there in the late afternoons, the only time I was permitted a reprieve from my studies. The gardens were a manicured wilderness of blooming night flowers and whispering willows, a place where I could almost breathe freely. And there he was sitting on a marble bench beneath the dappled shade of ancient oak, a book open but unread on his lap. He was paler than I had imagined, with his father's striking features etched onto a canvas of profound weariness. His hair was the same dark wheat color as the king's, but it fell across his brow without ceremony. He was wrapped in a heavy robe despite the day's warmth, and his posture was not one of royal grace, but of a bone-deep exhaustion. He was looking out, not at the beauty around him, but at some distant, painful point only he could see. In that fleeting moment, I felt a shocking, unexpected pang of connection. We were both prisoners here. I was a prisoner of a brand and a prophecy. He was a prisoner of his own blood. Our cages were different, but the isolation felt the same. A guard nearby shifted his stance, and the prince's head turned slightly. His eyes, a startling, clear blue, met mine across the expanse of manicured lawn. There was no curiosity in them, only a flat, empty acknowledgement before he looked away, dismissing my presence as he would a passing bird. The connection shattered, leaving me feeling more alone than before. The days settled into a strange rhythm. Mornings were spent with Linnea, my mind crammed with dates and sigils, the language of curses and the fragile grammar of hope. Afternoons were for the gardens, where I sometimes saw the prince, though we never spoke. Evenings were a silent, solitary affair in my beautiful room, where I would stand before the mirror and carefully change the bandage on my cheek. The brand was healing, the skin pulling tight and angry around the edges. It was a daily reminder of the chasm between this life of theoretical power and the brutal reality of my past. The king would summon me occasionally, his anxiety a palpable force in the room. He would ask after my studies, his eyes searching my face for some sign, some guarantee that his desperate gamble would pay off. His hope was a heavy mantle on my shoulders, a weight that grew with each passing day. I was the repository of a kingdom's fear and a father's love, a vessel chosen for a scar, living in a glorious, silent palace, waiting for a destiny I still could not fully comprehend. I was the key, studying the lock, all while feeling the desperate ticking clock of a dying prince's heart. The summons, when it came, was not to the library or the gardens, but to the prince's solar. The air in this wing of the palace was different, hushed and heavy, as if the very stones were holding their breath in sympathy for the occupant. My escort, a guard whose face I was beginning to recognize, gave me a curt, almost sympathetic nod. Before opening the door, the room was not what I expected. It was not a sick room, though a faint, herbal scent lingered beneath the smell of beeswax and old books. It was the chamber of a scholar. One wall was dominated by a vast window overlooking the mountains, flooding the space with cold, clear light. The others were lined with books, but these were not the ancient, leather-bound histories from the archives. These were treatises on astronomy, engineering schematics, volumes of natural philosophy. On a large table, a complex orrery of brass and silver sat stilled, a frozen universe awaiting its maker's hand. Prince Kaelen was seated in a high-backed chair near the fire, a blanket across his lap despite the warmth of the day. He was paler up close, the faint tracing of blue veins visible at his temples. But it was his eyes that arrested me. The king's eyes held sorrow. His son's held a storm of intelligent, bitter resentment. He did not rise. He merely watched me enter, his gaze a physical pressure that moved from my simple gown to the bandage on my cheek, which I had, by the king's explicit order, left uncovered for this audience. The king stood between us, a man desperately trying to bridge an impossible gap. Kaelen, this is Elara. Elara, my son. The prince's voice, when he spoke, was weaker than his father's, but it was sharp, honed by a fine and cutting intellect. "So you are the solution to all our problems." It was not a greeting. It was an accusation. I dipped into the curtsy. Linnea had drilled into me, my back stiff. "Your Highness, my father tells me you are the subject of some obscure prophecy. That he gestured vaguely toward his own cheek, misfortune is in fact a divine sigil. That you will perform a miracle. I am here to assist in any way the king believes I can, Your Highness." I kept my voice neutral, a flat pond refusing to ripple. A dry, humorless sound escaped his lips. "Assist? You mean you will stand there while old men chant over you, and everyone will hope the magic takes? It is a superstition, a pageant designed to give my father comfort while He trailed off, his gaze flickering toward the window, toward the distant, free peaks. While nature takes its course, anger, hot and sudden, flared in my chest. I had lost everything. I bore a permanent mark of ownership on my face. He saw it as a pageant, and if it is a superstition, Your Highness, what do you lose by humoring it? You dismiss my presence as a comfort for your father. Is it so terrible to allow him that? His eyes snapped back to me, a flicker of surprise in their blue depths. He had expected a cowed slave, not a rebuttal. I lose my dignity. The pretense is an insult to reason. I would rather face what comes with a clear mind than a head full of false hope. A clear mind, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. How fortunate you are to have that luxury. Some of us would gladly trade a little dignity for a chance to see the next sunrise. The king looked between us, a strange, conflicted expression on his face. He cleared his throat. "I will leave you to become acquainted." He left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone with the prince's simmering hostility. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. "You think me ungrateful," he said finally, not looking at me. "I think you are afraid," I replied, "and you are wearing your intellect as a shield against it." He turned his head slowly, the movement seeming to cost him effort. "And what do you know of my fears?" "I know the look of a trapped animal, Your Highness. I have seen it in a mirror." Something in my words gave him pause. His defiance seemed to waver, and for a moment, I saw not a prince, but a young man, terribly alone and staring into an abyss. He looked at the brand on my cheek, truly looked at it, not as a symbol, but as a wound. "How did you get it?" The question was quiet, stripped of its previous scorn. The story spilled out of me then, not the simplified version I gave the king, but the truth. The coldness of the manacles, the smell of the straw, the searing pain and the deeper humiliation. I told him of my father, the scholar, and the debts that outlived him. I did not look at him as I spoke. I looked at my hands, clenched in my lap. When I finished, the silence returned, but it was different now. The anger had gone out of it, replaced by a heavy, shared understanding. "They branded you for a debt you did not incur," he said, his voice low, "and you are dying for a curse you did not cast," I replied, finally meeting his gaze. It was the first truth that passed between us that was not filtered through prophecy or politics. It was a raw human connection. He did not speak for a long time. He looked from me to the intricate ori on his table, a model of a predictable, logical universe that had produced his utterly illogical fate. "What do you believe?" he asked, the question a concession. "I believe the world is far stranger than either of us knows," I said. "I believe that I have nothing left to lose by hoping for a miracle. And I suppose, I believe that if my suffering can be made to mean something, even for a stranger, then it was not entirely in vain." He absorbed this, his fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. The bitter prince was gone, leaving in his place a weary, thoughtful man. "Then I suppose," he said, the words seeming to surprise even him, "I have nothing to lose by hoping with you." It was not a surrender. It was a treaty, forged not in the heat of prophecy, but in the cold, common ground of shared desperation. The branded debtor and the cursed prince. We had begun. The air in the sacred grove was alive. It hummed with a latent energy that raised the fine hairs on my arms and made the back of my neck prickle. This was no longer the quiet, scholarly pursuit of history. This was the thing itself, the ancient, terrifying reality behind the words in Linnea's books. The grove was a circle of towering, silver-barked trees whose leaves whispered secrets to one another in a language just beyond hearing. Their branches were hung with delicate silver bells that did not chime in the wind, but stood utterly still. Underfoot, a carpet of deep green moss and night-blooming flowers soaked up the moonlight. their petals glowing with a soft, ethereal luminescence. At the center of the clearing, the royal seers, clad in simple gray robes, had drawn an intricate sigil using crushed amethyst, powdered silver, and dried herbs that released a sharp, cleansing scent into the night air. I stood at the heart of that sigil, my bare feet cool against the moss. I wore a simple shift of undyed linen, a garment that made me feel both vulnerable and strangely pure. The bandage was gone. The brand on my cheek felt exposed, a stark, dark blemish against the pale, magical light. Across from me, seated on a low stool of woven willow, was Prince Kaelen. He too was dressed simply, his face a mask of strained neutrality, but I could see the rapid flutter of his pulse at his throat. The king stood at the edge of the grove, a silent, watchful statue, his hope a tangible force pressing in on us. The head seer, an ancient woman with eyes like milky quartz, began the invocation. Her voice was not loud, but it carried, weaving through the trees, a low chant that seemed to resonate in my very bones. The other seers joined her, their voices creating a complex harmonic that vibrated in the air. The silver bells began to hum, though no wind stirred. Then the heat came. It started deep within the brand on my cheek, a sudden, searing warmth that was entirely separate from the night's chill. It was not the pain of the iron, not a destructive heat, but a kindling, a spark catching on tinder. I gasped as the warmth spread, flooding through my veins, a river of liquid light. The sigil on the ground began to glow, the lines of amethyst and silver igniting with a soft, violet-white fire that climbed up my legs, enveloping me without burning. I was the conduit, the key turning in the lock, my vision blurred, the physical world receding. I could feel him, Kaelen, not as a person across from me, but as a presence in the very energy that flowed through me. I felt the curse within him, a cold, dark, parasitic thing coiled around the core of his life force. It was an emptiness, a void that sucked at warmth and light, a knot of ancient malice that was intimately tangled with his soul. The sensation was violently invasive, a profound violation of his being that I experienced as a nauseating wave of cold despair. It was leeching him, moment by moment, and feeling its true nature firsthand was a horror beyond any description. The seer's chanting rose in pitch and intensity. The energy flowing through me sharpened, focusing into a single, brilliant point of intention. I was not directing it. I was merely its passage. The light poured from me, from the brand on my cheek that now throbbed with a power that was both agony and ecstasy, and streamed toward Kaelen. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound that was torn from the depths of his being. His body arched, not in pain, but in shock. I saw it then, a visible darkness, a shimmer of black smoke, seemed to writhe within the light that enveloped him, fighting against the purification. The cold of it bit into my own soul, a feedback of the curse's resistance. I felt my knees buckle, but I did not fall. The energy held me upright, and then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The light vanished. The humming ceased. The silver bells were still. The only sounds were our ragged, simultaneous gasps for air and the distant call of a night bird. The seer slumped, exhausted. I trembled violently, every muscle in my body turned to water. Across from me, Kaelen was panting, his hands gripping the sides of the stool, his knuckles white. He was shaking as badly as I was, but his eyes were wide open, and they were fixed on me. And in them was not the flat emptiness of before, nor the bitter resentment. There was awe, and there was life. I felt. He whispered, his voice hoarse. I felt it. Ease. The cold. It lessened. He took a deep, experimental breath, as if he had not truly filled his lungs in years. A shudder ran through him, one of profound relief. The king rushed forward, but Kaelen's gaze never left mine. We were connected in that moment by something far more fundamental than prophecy or politics. We had shared a journey into the darkest part of his being and had returned together. Slowly, weakly, Kaelen pushed himself up from the stool. He took a step toward me, then another, his movements tentative but his own. He stopped before me, his breathing still uneven. The aftermath of the ritual had stripped away all pretense, all titles. We were just a boy and a girl, shaken and alive. His hand rose, his fingers trembling slightly. He did not touch the brand itself, but hovered beside it, his eyes tracing its outline with a new, heartbreaking reverence. You are real, he breathed, the words a confession, a prayer, an apology. The simple touch of his fingers near my cheek, the awe in his voice, The shared vulnerability of the moment it transformed everything. The brand was no longer a mark of ownership or a magical sigil. In the quiet, trembling aftermath, under the moonlit trees, it became a testament, a shared secret, a bond forged in light and shadow, more intimate than any touch. The air in the palace, once filled with the hushed anticipation of a miracle, now thrummed with a different, darker frequency. It was a subtle shift, a change. In the quality of the silence in the corridors, a new wariness in the eyes of the servants who brought my meals. The prince's improvement was not a quiet thing. Color had returned to his cheeks. He was taking meals in the great hall. His voice, stronger now, could be heard debating philosophy with his tutors in the library. This visible return to life was a beacon of hope for the king and a direct challenge to those who had built their futures on his anticipated demise. I felt their eyes upon me, not the curious stares of before, but the cold, assessing gaze of a predator sizing up a threat. Lord Valerius, a cousin of the king's with a smile that never reached his eyes and ambitions that stretched as long as the shadow he cast, became a constant, unwelcome presence. He would appear at court functions, offering smooth congratulations to the king, his gaze always sliding over to me, lingering on my cheek with a calculation that made my skin crawl. He was a man who saw people not as souls, but as pieces on a board, and I had just been played in a move that ruined his game. The first incident was easily dismissed. A goblet of wine sent to my chambers, a gift, the note said, from a grateful well-wisher. The servant who brought it, a young girl with nervous hands, lingered a moment too long. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, perhaps it was the new, sharp instinct for survival that had been honed in me, but I hesitated. I thanked her and set the goblet aside. Later, a maid, thinking it abandoned, took a sip. The sounds of her retching, the frantic calls for a physician, they echoed through the stone hallway like a funeral dirge. It was declared a sudden, violent illness. But I knew the intended target. The wine was poured onto the earth of my window box. The plants withered and died within the hour. The second attempt was more direct. A balcony overlooking the royal gardens, a favorite place of mine to steal a moment of solitude. The stone balustrade was old, its masonry a patchwork of repairs. I often leaned against a particular section, finding a comfort in the view. One evening, as I went to take my usual place, a guard whose name I did not know, but whose face was etched with a hard-line decency, stepped forward. "A moment, my lady," he said, his voice low. He pressed his weight against the stone I usually leaned on. With a soft, grinding crunch, a sizable block shifted outward, teetering for a heart-stopping second above the 50-foot drop to the flagstones below. He hauled it back, his face grim. "The mortar has crumbled. It is not safe." His eyes met mine, and in them was a clear, unspoken warning. It was no accident. Paranoia became my constant companion. I tasted my food for strange bitterness. I checked the latches on my doors. I avoided shadowed corridors. The glorious Sunstone Palace had transformed into a beautiful, treacherous maze. The fear was a cold, not in my stomach, but it was accompanied by a fierce, burning anger. They would poison me. They would dash my brains out on the stones. They would erase the key to erase the hope. It was this anger that drove me to Kaelen's solar. I did not knock. I entered, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands clenched at my sides. He was at his table, studying a star chart, but he looked up, and the calm inquiry on his face vanished the moment he saw mine. "They are trying to kill me," I said, my voice shaking not with fear, but with rage. He was on his feet in an instant. The chart forgotten. What happened? I told him of the maid of the balcony. As I spoke, a change came over him. The thoughtful, sometimes weary prince was gone. In his place stood a man whose eyes glinted with a cold, protective fury. The color that had returned to his face deepened with a flush of anger. He moved around the table, stopping before me, his presence suddenly immense, no longer that of a convalescent, but of a sovereign. "You will take meals with me from now on," he said, his voice low and taut. "You will not walk alone. I will assign you a guard. His name is Rylan. You will trust him with your life, because I do." "Why?" The word burst from me, fueled by the injustice of it all. "Because I am your talisman? Because the prophecy requires my safety?" His hand came up then, not to hover, but to cradle my face, his thumb resting gently beside the brand, his fingers tangling in the hair at my temple. The touch was electric, a jolt that silenced my anger and replaced it with a breathless, aching Tension. No, he said, his voice raw, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that stole the air from my lungs. Because you are Elara, and the thought of any harm coming to you, it is unthinkable to me. In that moment, the careful boundaries between us dissolved. The shared vulnerability of the ritual, the intellectual kinship, it all coalesced into this. The fear that had driven me to him was burned away by the sheer, terrifying force of his declaration. It was not about the prophecy. It was not about the kingdom. It was about me. He did not kiss me. He did not need to. The way he looked at me, the possessiveness in his touch, the raw fear for my life in his eyes, it was more intimate than any kiss could ever be. The threat from the shadows had failed in its objective. It had not sent me cowering. It had not removed me from the board. Instead, it had forged the final, unbreakable link in the chain that bound us. We were no longer just the branded key and the cursed prince. We were two people, standing together in the light, staring into the darkness, and choosing each other. The air in the king's council chamber was thick enough to taste, a cloying mixture of old wood, beeswax, and the sharp scent of tension. Moonlight, pale and cold, streamed through the tall windows, etching the faces of the assembled men in silver and shadow. This was not a meeting of hope, but a tribunal of fate. The head seer, her milky eyes seeming to see beyond the room, had just laid bare the final, terrifying mechanics of the ritual that would occur on the night of the lunar eclipse. The magic requires a conduit and an anchor, she intoned, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. The sigil will channel the power, but the curse, ancient and sentient, will not simply vanish. It must be transferred, its essence unraveled, and bound to a new vessel. The ritual will not merely break the connection between the prince and the affliction. It will forge a new, permanent one. Their life forces will be tethered, irrevocably and for all time. 2 hearts, 1 rhythm. 2 souls, 1 fate. This is the cost of a heartbeat returned. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sharp intake of the king's breath. Then, the room erupted, preposterous. The word was a whip. Crack. Coming from Lord Valerius. He stood, his face a mask of outraged nobility. You speak of binding the future king, the sovereign ruler of this realm, to a branded commoner, to tie his destiny, the very fate of our kingdom, to an unknown quantity. This is not salvation. This is desecration. Other voices joined his, a chorus of dismay and fear from men who saw the world as a fixed hierarchy, a celestial order that this magic threatened to shatter. The line of succession would be compromised. It is an abomination against tradition. You would make a slave the heartbeat of a king? I stood slightly behind the king, my own heart hammering against my ribs so violently I feared they would hear it. The seer's words echoed in my mind. 2 souls, 1 fate, a permanent tether. It was a bond more profound than marriage, more intimate than any vow. It was a surrender of autonomy I had only just regained, to be forever tied, my life inextricably linked to his. The weight of it was crushing, a different kind of chain, and then came the deeper, more insidious fear. Did I have the right? Was my love for him, however real it felt in the secret places of my heart, strong enough to ask this of him? To chain a prince, a man of brilliant mind and boundless potential, to a woman with a scarred past and no name? Would it be an act of love, or the ultimate selfishness? The king was torn. I could see the war raging within him. The father's desperate love fought with the monarch's duty to his bloodline and his kingdom. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. There must be another way, he murmured, but it was a plea, not a statement. It was Prince Kaelen who ended the debate. He had been silent throughout, his face unreadable. Now, he rose. He was still thinner than he should be, but he stood with a new unshakable authority, his presence filling the room. All eyes turned to him. Enough. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a command. He did not look at the council. He looked only at me. The discussion is not whether this will be done. The discussion is ended. He took a step toward me, then another, moving through the crowd of stunned, silent men as if they were mere furniture. Kaelen, the king began, his voice thick with conflict. Father, Kaelen said, still holding my gaze. They speak of chains. They see a tether as a limitation. He stopped before me. The council, the king, the entire world, faded away. There was only him, his blue eyes blazing with a certainty that stole my breath. They are fools, He reached out and took my hands in his. His were warm, solid, real. "They ask what right you have to be bound to me," he said, his voice now meant only for me, though the entire room heard. "They ask the wrong question. The true question is, what right do I have to ask this of you? To tie your vibrant, fierce spirit to a life that will never be fully your own? To ask you to share not only my crown but the very essence of my being, with all its flaws and burdens?" Tears welled in my eyes, blurring his face. He dropped to one knee, there on the polished floor before his father's council, a prince kneeling before a once branded girl. He never looked away from me. "Elara," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "I am not asking you to save my life. I am asking you to share it, completely, utterly. I choose the tether. I choose you, not because of a prophecy, but because without you, a long life would be an endless, lonely curse. With you, it is the only future I desire." The last of my fears shattered. The voices of the council were nothing. The weight of tradition was dust. He was offering me not a chain, but a choice. He was offering me everything. I tightened my grip on his hands, my tears falling freely now. "Then I choose it too," I whispered, my voice strong and clear in the silent room. "I choose you." He rose, and in his eyes was a look of such profound love and relief that it felt like the sun dawning after a lifetime of night. The cost was immense. The price was everything, and we would pay it together. The throne room was a sea of silent, staring faces, a tapestry of hope, fear, and outright hostility woven from silk and suspicion. The air crackled with a tension more potent than any storm. Above, through the vast oculus in the vaulted ceiling, the moon began its slow, inexorable slide into shadow, the lunar eclipse, painting the world in tones of bruised silver and deepest night. This was no private ritual in a sacred grove. This was a coronation of will, a very public unraveling of fate. I stood at the center of the intricate, glowing sigil etched into the marble floor, the crushed gems and herbs humming with dormant power. Across from me, Kaelen stood tall and resolute, his posture that of a king, not a convalescent. Our eyes were locked, a lifeline in the swirling currents of doubt that filled the room. The king watched from his throne, his face a grim mask of paternal fear. And on the periphery, standing with a cluster of like-minded nobles, was Lord Valerius, his expression one of cold, calculated patience. He was waiting for his moment. The head seer's chant began, an ancient, guttural language that seemed to warp the very air. The familiar heat ignited in the brand on my cheek, but this time it was a conflagration. Power, raw and unimaginable, roared through me, a torrent of light that erupted from my core, blazing from the sigil on the floor and enveloping Kaelen in a column of pure, white energy. The connection was immediate, violent in its intimacy. I could feel the curse within him, a slick, black serpent of malice coiled around his soul, and I could feel it fighting back, thrashing against the light that sought to scour it clean. The eclipse reached its zenith. The world plunged into an eerie, profound darkness, broken only by the blinding light of our struggle. And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, Valerius made his move. A flick of his wrist, a nod to a guard whose loyalty he had bought. The guard drew a dagger, its edge catching the dim light, and lunged, not at me, but at Kaelen, seeking to end the prophecy by ending the prince. A cry tore from the king's throat. But it was too late. Yet the king had anticipated this final, desperate play. His own guards, loyal and true, moved with precision born of waiting. They intercepted the traitor, the clash of steel a sharp, ugly sound in the magical silence. Valerius's shout of fury was cut short as he was seized, his betrayal unveiled before the entire court in the stark, shadowless light of the eclipse. And our magic, through it all, Kaelen and I never broke our gaze. The assault, the betrayal, it was a distant ripple on the surface of a deep, shared ocean. Our joined hands were the anchor. The tether the seer spoke of was not something that would be formed after. It was forming now, in this maelstrom of light and shadow, a golden thread of pure will being spun between our hearts. I gave myself over to it completely. I was the conduit, the key, the vessel. I pushed every ounce of my strength, my hope, my newfound love into the light. The power crusted, a silent, shattering wave that exploded outward from us. I felt the black serpent of the curse unravel, its essence screaming as it was unmade, not transferred, but annihilated by the sheer force of our combined will. The light was so intense I saw the bones in my hands, saw the shock and wonder on Kaelen's face illuminated from within, and then it was over. The light vanished. The eclipse passed, and the moon's gentle glow returned to the world. The silence in the throne room was absolute. Stunned, Kaelen and I slumped toward each other, gasping, drained, but held upright by the hands we still clung to. He was the first to move. He took a deep, full breath, a sound that was a miracle in itself, the first truly easy breath he had drawn in a year. The pallor was gone. His eyes, when they found mine, were not just clear of pain, but blazing with a vibrant, unshadowed life. He was whole. Slowly, trembling with the aftershocks of power and emotion, he reached up. His fingers, gentle as a whisper, traced the brand on my cheek. I expected the raised, rough texture of the scar, but it was smooth, silken. He guided my hand up, letting my own fingertips feel what he felt. The angry, circular wound was gone. In its place was a delicate, intricate pattern, a filigree of silvery light etched into my skin. It was no longer a brand. It was a crown, a testament, a promise. Tears streamed down my face, but they were tears of joy, of release. He smiled, a true, unburdened smile that transformed his face, and he leaned his forehead against mine, our breath mingling, our hearts beating in a perfect, synchronized rhythm. King Theron descended from his throne, his own tears cutting paths through the regal sternness on his face. He did not speak. He simply placed his hands on our shoulders, his grip firm, a father blessing a future he had feared he would never see. Before the assembled court, the nobles who had supported us and those who had doubted, the king did not just proclaim his son healed. He named me Lady Elara, the curse breaker, the royal betrothed. His voice boomed with a finality that brooked no argument. Later, we stood together on a high balcony, the kingdom spread out before us in the moonlight. The air was sweet and cool on my skin, on the new silvery crown upon my cheek. Kaelen's arm was around me, holding me close against the night's chill, his heart a steady, strong drum against my back. I had been chosen by a king for a mark of shame, but I had been chosen by a prince for the heart that lay beneath it. The brand was gone. The scar that remained was not a reminder of what I had been, but a testament to what we had become together. Our story began with an end, and now, it began again, the end.